Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today we're going back to April 17th, 1865. On that day, outside of Durham Station, North Carolina, at the Bennett House, part of the Bennett Farm, there was a meeting of two prominent generals, William Tecumseh Sherman and Joseph E. Johnston. They were meeting together. It was their first meeting that would end with a negotiation and a document that was sent to Washington, D.C., soundly rejected by President Andrew Johnson and resulting in an intervention by Ulysses S. Grant, who had to take a train down to North Carolina, go find the generals, go find General Sherman, and sort of straighten out the mess. Turns out the negotiations, the settlement that was being proposed was far too broad. It touched on military surrender for all Confederates in the field, and it touched on peace recognition of the Southern Confederacy. It just wasn't going to work. And so Grant stepped in and basically wound up offering terms that were similar to the terms that he offered Lee just a few weeks earlier at Appomattox. Lost in all of this is the fact that on that initial meeting on April 17th, when Sherman and Johnston first met, Johnston received news from Sherman that Sherman's own staff didn't even know, hadn't heard yet, and that it was that Lincoln had been assassinated. So, in looking into this situation, I checked out the memoirs of Sherman and the military memoirs of Johnston, and both men talk about the moment that they learned about, or the moment that that information, that exchange occurred between Sherman and Johnston. So I'm going to read you these two accounts to give you a sense of the moment and what was going on in their brains and the larger situation. I'm going to start with Sherman because, well, his is just more descriptive and gives you a little bit of a backstory. It starts with him on a road on horseback with his staff, and then it goes from there. So let me read it to you and give you a sense of what was going on. Again, this is from Sherman's memoirs. We rode up the Hillsborough Road for about 5 miles when our flag bearer discovered another coming to meet him. They met, and word was passed back to us that General Johnston was near at hand when we rode forward and met General Johnston on horseback, riding side by side with General Wade Hampton. That's the South Carolina general. We shook hands and introduced our respective attendants. I asked if there was a place convenient where we could meet in private, and General Johnston said he had passed a small farmhouse a short distance back. When we rode back to it together, side by side, our staff officers and escorts following. We had never met before, though we had been in the regular army together for 13 years, but it so happened that we never met before, had never before come together. He was some 12 or more years my senior, but we knew enough of each other to be well acquainted at once. We soon reached the house of a Mr. Bennett, dismounted, and left our horses with the orderlies in the road. Our officers on foot passed into the yard, and General Johnston and I entered the small frame house. We asked the farmer if we could have the use of his house for a few minutes, and he and his wife withdrew to a smaller log house which stood close by. As we as soon as we were alone together, I showed him the dispatch announcing Mr. Lincoln's assassination and watched him closely. The perspiration came out in large drops on his forehead, and he did not attempt to conceal his distress. He denounced the act as a disgrace to the age and hoped I did not charge it to the Confederate government. I told him I could not believe that he or General Lee or the officers of the Confederate Army could possibly be privy to acts of assassination. But I would not say as much for Jeff Davis, George Sanders, and men of that stripe. Just pause for a second here. George Sanders is the well known gentleman who was involved in a series of activities in Canada. In fact, several books point to him as being the mastermind of the Lincoln assassination, or at least a key player. Much of that is still conjecture. Sherman goes on, we talked about the effect of this act on the country at large and on the armies, and he realized that it made my situation extremely delicate. I explained to him that I had not yet revealed the news to my own personal staff or to the army, and that I dreaded the effect when made known in Raleigh. Mr. Lincoln was peculiarly endeared to the soldiers, and I feared that some foolish woman or man in Raleigh might say something or do something that would madden our men, and that a fate worse than that of Columbia would befall the place. Of course, Sherman is talking about the fate of Columbia, the fire that broke out and burnt key parts of the town, including the government district. So there's Sherman's side of the story. Now, let me get to Johnston's version coming from his military memoirs. And his is a bit more concise, but it gives you a sense. In fact, they agree pretty much in the essence of it. So here we go. Johnston says, General Sherman met me at the time and place appointed, the house being that of a Mr. Bennett. As soon as we were without witnesses in the room assigned to us, General Sherman showed me a telegram from Mr. Stanton. It's Edwin M. Stanton, Secretary of War. He goes on. General Sherman showed me a telegram from Mr. Stanton announcing the assassination of the President of the United States. A courier, he told me, had overtaken him with it after he left a railroad station from which he had ridden. After reading the dispatch, I told General Sherman that, in my opinion, the event was the greatest possible calamity to the South. Johnston goes on to talk about the initial letter he had sent Sherman, and that it seemed to him that the details of the letter escaped Sherman because he was actually proposing a larger armistice between the armies and the governments. And the whole Lincoln assassination just added a whole new dimension. It made an already impossible negotiation even more difficult, in his words, in Johnston's words, more delicate. So here's these two men on April 17th, the civilian leader, the commander-in-chief of the Union Army and the head of the government has been assassinated. New man, President Johnston, is in place. Sherman and Johnston are trying to figure out what's the best way forward. The situation on the ground has changed dramatically since Lee and Grant had their exchange just a couple weeks earlier. Lincoln was still alive. The hopes of the Confederacy were still pretty much alive. There was a thought that Lee might break away and get away. Of course, Richmond falls on April 2nd. The government evacuates on April 3rd. 6 days later, you have Appomattox, and then the whole thing changes. So that's where Sherman and Johnston find themselves when they get together on April 17th. And so I really am interested in the impact of the Lincoln assassination, not only in the moment that I'm sharing here, but overall in the larger picture on this negotiation. Pretty clear that had Lincoln still been alive, at least in Johnston's opinion, there might have been perhaps a greater opportunity to do some further negotiation. I don't think that that Lincoln, in fact, would have been more lenient in this situation. He might have acted just as President Johnston did, in saying there's no way that we're going to negotiate an armistice between the two countries. So there you have it, some readings from Sherman's memoirs and Johnston's military memoirs about that moment, that devastating moment for both sides when the news of the assassination of President Lincoln is shared between Sherman and Johnston. So take care, and we'll see you on the next episode.